I'm speaking to you today from my offices here in Vancouver, which are located on the traditional unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, which are the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. If you don't know about Creative BC, we are an organization that is supported by the province of British Columbia to serve as an industry catalyst where we help the creative sector reach its economic, social, environmental, and creative potential. And we're really proud to be partners with MAGS BC, as well as supporting this workshop today. It really is workshops like this that help bring us together and bridge storytelling between our creators and a world through an equitable lens. As you've heard, our speaker today is Andrea Bennett, who is joining us from the territory of the Tla'amin people. Andrea Bennett is a National Magazine Award-winning non-binary writer and senior editor at the Tyee. Their most recent book, Like a Boy But Not a Boy, an essay collection, was a CBC Books pick for the top Canadian nonfiction of the year and one of Otto Straddle's best queer books of 2020. Andrea has worked as an editor in the book and magazine publishing industry for over 10 years. Thank you to everybody. Have a great workshop and welcome, Andrea.
My name is Andrea Bennett, as Asna said. I'm a writer and editor living in Powell River, BC. That's Tisquat, BC, not Bisquee, on the traditional territories of the Tla'amin Nation. I'm the author of the essay collection, Like a Boy But Not a Boy. I'm currently the managing editor for the Tyee.ca. Had a promotion in between submitting that bio and today. And I used to edit for Talad Books. I'm the former editor-in-chief of Maisonneuve magazine, and I've edited for a handful of other magazines, including this magazine, Adbusters, and Prism International. Before I worked as an editor, I worked in communications, bilingual communications. So I've been copy editing in some way, shape, or form for a very long time now. I'm also a white settler of English descent. I'm non-binary, and I'm bipolar 2 with generalized anxiety disorder. I also recently found out I'm hard of hearing. That was an interesting surprise. So that's how I inhabit the world, and those are the lived experiences that inform my perspectives as a writer and an editor. The other thing to mention, copy editing wise, is that I have the ability to be very detail oriented. I can tell the difference between an N and an M dash immediately. This is a skill that many people can develop, but it's not the be all and end all. For me, I would rather see the forest than the trees. I'll take a misplaced apostrophe over an incorrect pronoun any day because no one gets hurt by a misplaced apostrophe. So that's me, that's where I'm editing from, and sort of my position on that kind of stuff. So what is a house style guide and why do we have them? As many of you probably know, a house style guide directs copy editing choices for magazines, newspapers, and publishing houses. Publishing houses usually have an overarching style guide, and then a copy editor for any given book will also make a style sheet for each individual book. In that case, they may opt to go for an author's preference. That could be something like Andrea prefers unspaced M dashes to spaced N dashes, which I do. But it can also be something like this author prefers not to italicize words in Italian. And in that case, or the author prefers to not to italicize words in Cree. We can talk about that more later, but I'll note here that it's still a pretty common practice in predominantly English or majority English language books to italicize words that don't appear in the Oxford Canadian Dictionary. And the idea is to demarcate foreign words. But let's say a writer is writing in Cree in English, it would be very problematic to demarcate Cree as foreign there, because technically English is foreign. And even when we're not talking about languages spoken by Indigenous peoples, there are long colonial histories attached to the English language, and it can be othering to prioritize English over other languages. And if you have long passages too in a language other than English, it actually gets quite difficult to read italics for a long period of time. So this is one instance where if I'm copy editing a book, I prefer to give the writer the option of choosing how they want to handle it. And if I'm working in a magazine environment, I have tended in the past to make the case to have the style guide either keep everything Roman or unitalicized, or again, I would prioritize the writer's preference over consistency. And then I'll just pause on consistency for a second. Consistency across articles, issues, and books is one of the main reasons why we have house style guides. And in general, the idea is to use things like spelling and punctuation consistently throughout a magazine and from issue to issue, and to be consistent within a book, and to a lesser extent from book to book. So yeah, it's something that is probably important to many of us, but I feel like we need to hold it in balance with other considerations. Okay, so resources when building a style guide. So most publishers and magazines don't build a style guide from scratch. Instead, we rely on an existing style guides, resources, and dictionaries and build from there. So you usually have two core texts. You'll have a style guide and a dictionary. So Canadian book publishing context, this is often the Chicago Manual of Style and the Canadian Oxford Dictionary. And in newspaper context, it's CP style, which specifies that it should be paired with Canadian Oxford also, but then there's CP caps and spelling, which has preferences for certain spellings. And yeah, their title case preferences are different also. So depending on how your magazine positions itself in the world, you'll fall probably on either two of these spots, but magazines are a little bit more, some of you are probably using CP style. I'll be curious to know actually. And then others of you will probably be a little bit more like book publishing. And then there are lots of additional resources that should be considered. So Gregory Younging's Elements of Indigenous Style, published in 2018, is a really great text to read and pull from when you're building out your style guide. Chelsea Vowell's Indigenous Rights, a guide to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit issues in Canada. This book isn't a style guide, but it's pretty key for all non-Indigenous writers and editors in Canada to have read. I would say it gives a really great primer on, well, lots of different things. So when you might want to use, for example, Indigenous as an umbrella term, and then when you want to specify, which First Nation you're talking, it just gives it's a really good backgrounder on a lot of these issues and the way that history influences our contemporary usage. The Trans Journalists Association Trans Style Guide, that one's pretty great and pretty key. This is an area also in which there's been a lot of development and growth in the past 5 to 10 years in terms of our usage, common usage. The GLAD Media Reference Guide is another LGBTQ2S guide to look at. The Race Forward Race Reporting Guide. And then here's one that I don't have a link for, but I can share the PDF if anyone's interested. But it's about destigmatizing language around substance abuse and going towards like a harm reduction model of reporting. And that's from the BC Centre for Disease Control. Autistic Hoya's Glossary of Ableist Phrases. Google's Ngram Viewer. So I'm going to bring something else up to look at that. So basically it lets you, I'll pull my window over. There we go. It lets you compare different usages over time. So you'll notice like I have a comma there with no spaces. That's how it likes to be talked to. So I'm comparing Kit Kat with a space versus Kit Kat with no space. So, when we're copy editing, part of what we're doing is just looking for what's common usage. There are a couple different approaches to copy editing. And one, I guess, is a top-down approach, which is these are the rules and it's my job to enforce them. And the other one is sort of a bottom-up approach, like grammar and spelling come from usage. So what's the most common usage? So here you'll see like Kit Kat and Kit Kat are pretty similar. And in this case, I'd probably go to the chocolate bar's website to double check. But then also, let's say we're choosing between bike and bicycle. Yeah, bike is way more common at this point. So that might influence a copy editing choice you're going to make. But it comes in handy from time to time if there's no definitive answer in Canox, or if you have a question that comes from outside of Canox, unanswerable by Canox. It's also just fun to play around with. Let's see. Oh, let's just do one more. Motorbike versus motorcycle is good too. It's way less of a deviation than bike and bicycle. And you can toggle between British English and American English, which helps. Anyway, okay. And then finally, the conscious style guide. I'd suggest, I think the conscious style guide and radical copy editor, which was recommended to me by Iva Chung. They both have newsletters you can sign up for. And they'll sort of look at a particular case and then expand from there. They're both handy to follow. There's a sex work style guide. This was recommended by Remy Gallant at the Whores of Yore. And then use the right words, media reporting on sexual violence in Canada. And this is also recommended by Remy Gallant. So your house style guide should reflect your values. Style guides allow us to impose consistency on a text, but we choose that consistency based on common usage. That's true actually of the top-down approach also. It's just an approach that changes over a glacial pace rather than a quicker one. My personal feeling is that as usage changes, so should our style guides. I never pledged allegiance to Chicago or MLA or CP style, and I don't own my allegiance to the dictionary either. All of these are things that I use as tools in my work. An author might have a good reason for choosing inconsistent usage. And my job as a copy editor is to query and point out that inconsistent usage and allow them to make a choice about what they want to do. All of it is in service of the text. If and when following any given style guide ceases to be in service of the text, I prioritize the text. And there's also, there are always learning curves for all of us. I remember, about 6 years ago, I was copy editing a text that I had done a substantive edit on first, actually, but it used the terms, it was about an issue that was happening that involved Mi'kmaq people. And I didn't know at the time that there was a difference between Mi'kmaq in the plural and the singular. And so the adjective gets the singular. And so I accidentally corrected and then had to completely redo all of my fake corrections because something that I saw as inconsistent was actually just ignorance on my part. So querying these things from the get-go is always great. Even if you are familiar with what you are copy editing, there may still be a good reason. Anyway, And if you're not copy editing from an anti-oppressive perspective, you may inadvertently be copy editing from an oppressive one. The status quo can be. So that's another thing I try to keep in mind. Let's see. So the first step in copy editing is to develop a good relationship with the writer. It does not matter how deftly you handle the copy edit of someone's text if you don't give them a sense that you respect them and their time. So what I mean by that is pretty simple. It's actually, unfortunately, fairly common for an editor to sort of ghost a writer for a while and then pop back up in their inbox asking for a quick turnaround. There's often a bit of a power imbalance between a writer and an editor. The editor generally has more power in the relationship. They might have a staff job, whereas the writer is pitching an article or a book or a project. The writer might feel then that they can't say no to a quick turnaround, even if it isn't good for them and upends their life. Thankfully, there's a good solution for this, and maybe you might all probably do this already, but I've had a lot of experience both as a writer and as an editor. So I've been a writer on the side of, don't hear from an editor for 4 weeks and then they want me to turn something around in 24 hours. So the solution is to share a timeline at the outset with the writer and ask if they foresee any issues with that timeline. Be as clear and upfront with your timelines and your expectations as possible from the outset. And then, you can make it clear that there's some conversation to be had about that if there's something that doesn't work. The next thing is to phrase your queries as queries. So copy editing includes having a good understanding of proper grammar and punctuation usage. If I see a comma splice or a run-on sentence or a colloquial approach to subject-object agreement or a non-parallelist structure, my job is not simply to correct it. My job is to query that. So for a comma splice, I might write comma splice okay here in a comment bubble. Or should we make this list parallel with my suggested rewrite in a comment bubble? But the author might be choosing a comma splice or even a non-parallel list intentionally. Sometimes, depending on the size of the text, my relationship with the writer, that kind of thing, our time constraints, I might make the change and leave a comment. Okay to make this change, or I'll make the change to make it clear in my email transmission note that my changes are suggestions. And I'll always leave track changes on so that the author can see what it is that I've done. In a book situation, or a long magazine article where someone has, let's say, misspelled a famous person's name 32 times or 300 times, then I'll have track changes on to make that first change. I will turn them off and make the subsequent 299 or 31 changes without the track changes on, because that person only needs to see that first change and I'll have a comment bubble there. They do not need to see the red underline 29 or 301 more times. It's too many times. I think I had 31. I think that's okay. And then ultimately, I think a writer's job is to tell a good story. A writer doesn't need to be able to spell well in English or use apostrophes correctly. It's okay if they don't. That's my job. I have no judgment about it. And the process of copy editing, to me, ideally should feel like a collaborative relationship. I owe more to the author and to the heart of the writing than I owe to the grammar. Okay, so focusing on LGBTQ2S+, the two resources I'm suggesting here are the Trans Journalists Association Trans Style Guide and the GLAAD Media Reference Guide. And there are some things to watch out for that pop up somewhat commonly. I was a kid in the 90s, and I don't know if anyone watched the semi-recent Disclosure documentary on Netflix, It referred to a lot of media that stood out really clearly from my childhood. Depictions of trans people on television that were really othering and pretty transphobic, like on Jerry Springer. I don't know if any of you remember this, but can you tell the real women from the female impersonators? That kind of thing. So it's interesting to think about how much things have changed and in some ways not changed since then. But yeah, there's still a lot of interesting stuff that happens. And when it comes to the top-down approach, like the New York Times, for example, and outlets like them, will be really slow to accept terms like mix, which is a non-binary honorific. And so they'll ask their source to choose between Mr., Ms., and that only changed, 2 or 3 years ago for them. It's very, very recent. Okay, so use the correct pronouns and honorifics for someone. Don't dead name or misgender them. So dead name means don't use the name. Misgender, don't refer to the person by the gender that they were assigned at birth. And then dead name means if they have changed their name as part of a gender transition, or like any other reason, frankly, for that reason. Don't use their former name that they don't use anymore. This includes when describing them in the past. Watch out for coverage that emphasizes someone's identity or pronouns when it doesn't need to. So, if it's a piece that's about bike mechanics and it's not a piece that's zeroing in on gender, it's a piece that's talking about like disc brakes, you don't need to mention that the source is trans. Coverage that treats LGBTQ2S people as an afterthought or doesn't include us at all. So for example, I'm a non-binary person who gave birth. Most of the material surrounding birth and pregnancy has been directed at women. And additionally, a lot of the language around families is very cisnormative and heteronormative, a child's mother and father. Families come in a variety of different structures. This comes up a lot in health reporting. There are women and non-binary people who need to know, for example, also like when is a good time to get screened for prostate cancer. So it's really important to write in a way that is inclusive of everyone. If people don't see themselves in health reporting, they will actually not go to the doctor to get checked for those things. It's a barrier. And there's a lot of anxiety about what that doctor's visit's going to look like. And so it actually does have an impact on people's health. You can flag tropes as well. So there's often been a fixation on physical transition or family response, or on whether people pass when it comes to writing about trans people. You can flag a narrative gaze that overemphasizes details about someone's body or relationships. In short, if something wouldn't be a subject of focus for a cis person or straight person and it's not germane to the story, it might not need to be mentioned. So for example, Ellie was at the farm to buy her wife, Jane, who has been out as trans for 3 years, a Mother's Day bouquet. If this story is about Jane's journey to having her motherhood be recognized as a trans woman, then okay, cool, it's relevant, keep it in. If the story is about a flower farm, I'd suggest a rewrite there. Ellie was at the farm to buy her wife, Jane, a Mother's Day bouquet. Okay, race. So the Race Forward reporting guide is a good resource I'd suggest reading and checking out. All of these resources that I'm plunking at the top here, they're all ones that I would suggest just like reading through the whole guide when you have a moment. And then you can refer to them later on when you have a specific question. But it's kind of nice to do a skim of the whole thing. Okay, so things to look out for here, mentioning the race of someone who's racialized, but not the white people in a story. Another thing to look out for, especially in Canada, is avoiding mentioning race when it is germane to a story. For example, when you're discussing something like voting rights or exclusionary housing prices or even practices or even COVID-19 deaths, when you're discussing policing, any time where there are systemic, structural things or issues at play, avoiding talking about the race of the people in the story is, in a sense, sort of like whitewashing or papering over some of the dynamics at play. Okay, avoid stereotypes, these so-called positive ones and the negative ones. So, for example, like model minority myth, have an eye out for that. Avoid tropes. Avoid including BIPOC sources only when discussing issues related to race. So BIPOC sources, racialized folks should appear in a wide range of stories, and racialized folks should be able to write a wide range of, oh gosh, sorry, I'm having real trouble this morning, should be able to write a wide range of stories. So it's the same with like LGBTQS folks. Don't just think of your writer when you have a story about queer families. Like, try to be thinking of them in other cases. They probably have other interests and knowledge areas as well. And it can really pigeonhole writers when you're only thinking of them in terms of their identity. If someone's race or ethnicity is important to the piece, be specific about it. So if the piece is focusing, for example, on how COVID has had a disproportionate impact on Filipino Canadian nurses in Canada or Caribbean Canadian nurses, say Filipino Canadian rather than Asian Canadian, or Caribbean Canadian, or Jamaican, Trinidadian, if that's the case, rather than Black Canadian nurses. But there's like an important caveat there: go with someone's preference. So if they've just described themselves a certain way, your writer can query with them. But if they have a preference, like, no, I would like to be referred to as an Asian Canadian nurse, then go with that preference. Watch out for coded language. For example, immigrants flooding the border at non-standard crossings or inundating an area, that kind of thing. Prioritize impact over intent, and prioritize action over attitude and intention. So this can sometimes be referred to as decentering whiteness. In any given situation, the impact of a racist action is more newsworthy and worth more focus than the intention that occurred before the action. So oftentimes, if, let's say, a 22-year-old white male does something that has a very racist impact, there can be an impulse in traditional media, to try to make excuses for that person, or I don't know, run a photo of them volunteering at a food bank or something like that along with this story, or, oh, they were a really hard day that day, that kind of thing. A lot of sort of empathizing with that person. And I don't know if we'll get to it, but there is an interesting example of this in Vancouver's Awesome recently that maybe some of you saw, where a former Proud Boy was stabbed at a house party after he was identified as having been involved in an altercation where he was violent towards a group of Indigenous people, including a young Indigenous woman. And Vancouver's Awesome ran a piece about the incident with the woman first, but then they ran a follow-up piece after the fellow was stabbed, kind of giving his side of the story, and they came under a lot of fire for that. That's not exactly a copy editing choice. It would be something I would flag if I was copy editing for them. But sometimes in your copy editing, you have really no control over like the editorial choices that someone higher up at a magazine is making. So all you can do is flag it and say like, hey, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, we can talk more about that in the examples section if we get to it. Okay, Indigenous peoples. So the resources I'm suggesting here are Gregory Younging's Elements of Indigenous Style and Chelsea Vowell's Indigenous Rights, a guide to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit issues in Canada. So things to consider. Indigenous languages should take precedent. Indigenous place names should take precedent, including in stories that are not about Indigenous issues. So I live in Tisquat, BC. Gosh, I really want to say Biscuit today, which is kind of a fun way to say BC, but not accurate, which is otherwise known as Powell River. It is a town that's undergoing a conversation about a name change because Israel Powell was one of the early architects of residential schools in Canada, and the Tla'amin Nation wants to see the name change. And so usually when I'm referring to where I live, I'll say Tisquat, which was the Tla'amin term for an area that of early settler incursion, essentially, where our mill is. Anyway, but I would say that I try to say that all the time, not just when I'm talking about like the history or the mill. Indigenous is an umbrella term that includes First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So sometimes it's going to be the right term to use, and other times First Nations will be more accurate, or Métis or Inuit, or being specific makes the most sense. So if it's something that involves the Haida Nation, someone who is Haida, you would say Haida and not Indigenous. But again, important to note, always go with someone's preference. Another important thing, so like ownership of stories, or who gets to tell a story, or how a story gets told. In Indigenous contexts, and in some other contexts, it's always good to check this with folks, but particularly in Indigenous contexts, that ability to tell a story or share a story that doesn't line up with the Canadian legal system's ideas about copyright or defamation. So you might be legally in the clear, but ethically, you need to pursue a different approach to like permissions and follow like the protocols of the nation that you're working with. And it's just always something to be aware of. I was proofreading a book once that had a poem, and it was a book by an Indigenous author. And they had used the example of, or they had written a poem about a missing and a murdered Indigenous woman, but not from their nation. And so I flagged that poem to ask about whether they had sought sort of permission from the family to use that woman's story, and they hadn't, and so we ended up revising the book. And the author was actually really grateful that we'd raised it as part of our process, because as soon as she thought about it, she was like, "Oh yeah, okay, oops." And so we couldn't get the poem. If we'd recognized that a bit earlier in the process, we would have been able to follow through protocol. And but anyway, it's always good to have an eye out for. Understand the perspective from which a storyteller is working. If they're working from a different paradigm, discuss how best to work together. So I mentioned this at the top, but the very most important thing is to develop a good relationship with the writer. And Yeah, they might just be approaching the text from a different position than you. They might have different ideas about the role of an editor or a copy editor and how that relationship works. It's always just good to have a chat about it. And then, as with the aforementioned themes we've chatted about, avoid stereotypes and focus on systems. And watch out for passive voice and deletion of the state's role. Let's see. When a newspaper reports on an issue that's affecting a particular Indigenous community, they might just focus on the issue without sort of zooming back to give some context about why that issue is happening. That might happen at the sentence level. It might happen at the structure of the piece, but it's your job as a copy editor to flag that. I mean, in the case of the structure of the piece, it really should be the editor that's flagging it, to be honest. But sometimes it gets through. Ableism. Ooh. All right, I'm going to try to speed up my pace here. So I'm recommending Autistic Hoya's glossary of ableist phrases here. Ableism is baked into the way we speak. I'm just going to give some examples at the top here. So when I say committed suicide, I flag and change to died by suicide. Instead of blind to, you can choose ignorant. Instead of crazy or bipolar, you could choose wild. Avoid things like confined to a wheelchair or bound to a wheelchair. Use something like uses a wheelchair. It's a mobility device. It helps one get around. Avoid person first language. So this one actually, it depends on what someone prefers. And this is a usage I would say is changing, but many disabled people do not like person first language. So person with a disability, for example, or person who has autism. Many people prefer autistic person or disabled person. So make sure make sure that the writer has asked how someone wants to be identified, and have some important in-house conversations about what you want your narrative voice to be like in general, because there's a difference. When your narrative voice moves closer to your source and how they identify, you use the terms that they want. And when you're in your sort of like house style voice, then that's representing you, your organization, your magazine, and your voice. So there might be a difference between those two things, but you should have an idea about what your magazine's preference is and why. And this is a conversation that disabled folks in your organization should be involved in. When writing about accommodations that someone might need, focus on systemic or structural gaps rather than the issue as a personal issue. Let's assume that everyone deserves to access a building, use a toilet, etc., and don't pay inordinate attention to someone's body. If it's germane to the writing, be clear about the need or accommodation. Jane, who uses a wheelchair, requires ramp access to the building, rather than Jane, who has been confined to a wheelchair since a tragic car accident, requires ramp access to the building. If a story is about disability, include several disabled people as sources, including family members of someone with a disability is not the same as including a disabled person. Avoid tropes or stereotypes. So avoid the inspiring disabled person, avoid the burden of taking care of a disabled person. Substance use and addiction. So I'm recommending media and language, destigmatizing language around substance abuse and harm reduction reporting. This is another area that's changed quite a lot over the past 5 to 10 years. So approach addiction as a health issue and consider using toxic or poison to refer to drugs when discussing accidental overdose. So saying 500 people died of poison drugs has a different effect than saying 500 people died from overdose. It gets people thinking about safer supply rather than implying someone took too much of something or took it improperly. And it's just more accurate in terms of the crisis that's unfolding in BC. Don't sensationalize someone's drug or alcohol use. Addiction and death by poison drugs are not necessarily one-to-one issues. So someone may have an addiction issue and die by poison drugs. Someone may just be going out to a party and thinking they're taking MDMA and it's not actually MDMA. And so they have taken what becomes an overdose. And so this comes up in terms of, when we're talking about the poison drug crisis, we're not talking just about access to services that help folks who are addicted. Anyway, if you have an eye out for this and go and read a bunch of newspaper articles after this, you'll see what I'm talking about. It comes clear in examples. Avoid moralistic approaches and stereotyping. Use people who use drugs rather than addicts or other language. And think about uses like clean. So if we have a quote where someone said, in December of 2020, I was trying to get clean and yada, yada, and that person is a person who uses drugs, I'm not going to flag that quote to be changed because it's their own language. They're referring to their own situation. But if I get copy in and the writer has said, so-and-so had been trying to get clean since December of 2020, I'm going to flag that and ask them to rewrite it in a way that avoids that language, because the sort of dichotomy between like clean, if you say clean, then the other half of that is dirty. And, that's just stigmatizing. But when people are talking about their own experiences, they have a right to describe it however they want to describe it. It's just when you move to paraphrase or narrative voice that you need to be a little more cautious. That's true of everything. If a trans person describes themselves in a certain way and you use the quote, fine. The writer cannot use that same language to describe them, depending. When writing stories about people who use drugs, always interview people who use drugs. Sex work style guide. So I'm recommending this one from the Whores of Yore. Things to think about. Again, this is in your narrative voice. Avoid problematic, stigmatizing terms like hooker, prostitute, and pimp, which remove agency from sex workers. Avoid phrases like selling her body. Instead, use sex worker as a broader term and or use the terms, specific terms that indicate the type of sex work someone is practicing. Again, another nothing about us without us. When writing about an issue related to sex work, always interview and include sources who are sex workers, or assign the story to someone who does sex work. That's an option for all of these things. Sexual violence. Again, suggesting use the right words. Things to think about. Who do we find believable? So you can think back to the early reporting on Giangomeshi and his Facebook statement. And a lot of folks came to his defense before the whole story came out. Assault should be taken seriously, but not sensationalized. So always question whether, if you're writing about someone else's story, what details are germane to include. And this comes in at the interviewing stage too. Well, that's a much big, we're not going to get into that today, actually. Avoid overusing terms like claims or claimed and alleged. So sometimes it's going to be legally necessary to use those terms, but you don't need to use them every single time someone speaks in a piece. The overall effect of that will make it seem as though you do not believe what that person is saying. You're sort of calling into question, like literally everything that they have said. There are legally necessary times when you have to use it it's definitely, I mean, there are a lot of examples in Canada about different defamation suits that are ongoing. Yeah. And this probably actually, especially when it comes to stories about sexual violence, as a copy editor, it's always a good idea to flag to your editor anything that you feel might need to be vetted by a lawyer. It's always better to be careful. It's probably already something the editor is thinking about, hopefully, but always good to flag. Focus on the harm done to the survivor rather than the consequences a perpetrator of assault may face. Avoid tropes like the jilted ex-girlfriend trope or sleeping their way to the top trope. When speaking more generally about assault, try to be inclusive. Women, men, and non-binary people all experience assault. People tend to, depending on what group you belong to, some folks face it disproportionately, but everybody faces assault. So just be conscious about that when constructing sentences. You might want to be inclusive and then zero in on that disproportionate effect. And then be careful and neutral in headline phrasing, titles, etc. Don't be overly sensationalized. Keep all of those sort of legal things in mind. It's very difficult to write a good title or headline for these kinds of stories. Okay, so this approach is an approach, not a set of rules. When a person is writing about or talking about their own experience in their own community, as a copy editor, it's a good idea to allow them more leeway in language usage. Always opt for someone's preferred self-identification. Again, be aware of the difference between narrative voice and subject/interviewee voice. And I gave this example before, but an interviewee saying, "I want to get clean" is very different from a narrative voice saying, "Jane wanted to get clean." Or, for example, here we go. Humorous host chooses laughs over lectures. Going native host Drew Hayden Taylor chooses laughs over lectures. First of all, the head and deck repeat, which is a cardinal sin, however you look at it. But then let's say Drew Hayden Taylor, I don't think he said this in the piece, but let's say he said, "I choose a laugh over lectures." Okay, that's fine. You can have that. It's fine for him to say that. And it probably comes in a context where he's been chatting about other stuff. But to put it in the headline implies that, this good Indigenous person is choosing laughs. Whereas, as opposed to like all these other folks who are protesting pipelines, it's a real downer. Yeah. That is an example of where, narrative voice needs to diverge or summarize differently. You use your judgment when copy editing nonfiction versus fiction versus poetry. You might have things that are offensive in a novel, but they're offensive for a particular reason. You have to take everything into consideration, and the way that I approach nonfiction is different from the way I approach fiction and poetry. Just kind of have to use your judgment. The most important thing to cultivate is an awareness or sensitivity and just read a lot. And then everything changes. So your style guide and your copy editing approach can and should and will change over time as you learn more, as culture changes, there are lots of reasons. Always try to take your cue from people working at the forefront of any of these issues, people that have a stake in these issues. But also note, for example, like not everybody who has a disability is an expert or a disability activist. For example, like personally, I'm pretty willing and able to talk about mental illness, and I have systemic critiques about healthcare when it comes to mental illness. But I only very recently found out that I'm hard of hearing and probably have been for much of my life. And I'm currently now just very personally focused on what that means for me and my journey of finding for and figuring out how to pay for a corrective hearing or the correct hearing aids. I am absolutely not qualified to offer any expert opinion on like that particular issue, and would not position myself as a spokesperson for the deaf or hard of hearing communities in any way, shape, or form. So it's nuanced. Nicole Bross shares that they use the NCDJ disability language style guide. That looks great. And yeah, Lisa, 15 years ago, person first was the preference. Yes, that is something that has changed. And, you know, it's going to be different for some disabled people. Some people with disabilities will still prefer that person first language. So it's a case by case approach in some ways. I just see a clarification question. Can you clarify what person first means? So that just means person first way of saying, let's use two examples. So person with a disability. So in that case, I'm literally putting the person first and then having with a disability follow, or I say disabled person. And so you can see like the person comes second in that example. And so initially about 15 years ago, the thinking was that you should focus on the person, the individual, and that consideration of any disability they have should come second. The disability community, the reason why that's changed is because most people with disabilities don't think that any of us should be ashamed of having disability. And also that forefronting it, forefronts conversations about ableism. And essentially, yeah, helps reduce some of the stigma and shame associated with disability. And it, you know, it's not a personal thing to carry. The issue with anything surrounding disability and being in the world is that the world is not an accommodating place. It's not a personal failing of any way, shape, or form. And it's an identity for some folks. Everybody feels a bit differently about it. Oh yes, it's worth querying the word overdose and how it's used. Yes, that's a really good point, Asna. There are ways to write around it. It can be tricky. Yeah. Moira Witten, who I work with at the Tyee, who's the Tyee's health reporter, has been working a lot in this area, and her coverage is a great example of something to look at for someone who is being really conscientious about their language. If I had a question, I would probably defer to her or take a look at her work.
We have a great comment in the chat. Austin Killerland says, interesting how we are moving away from person with a disability to disabled person, but at the same time moving away from drug user towards person who uses drugs.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that is a good point. I think the term is really, it's, the term to really avoid is like addict. It's going to vary between person to person, how they feel about drug user versus person who uses drugs. And there are a lot of folks, people who use drugs who are working in this area, like as self-advocates and pushing forward a lot of policy in BC. Like it has tended to be people who use drugs who force the social change that's necessary. Yeah, so there are a lot of different great resources. in Vancouver, there's Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users, and there's DOLF, Drug Users Liberation Front. So you can even tell from like those two titles that drug user is there. So yeah, I think it just basically depends on context a little bit, but you could potentially use drug user, just probably not addict. Yeah.
Hi, Kathy, you have a question. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask it directly? Awesome.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Tyee and I'm in Detroit, Michigan, and it's sort of a particular case, but I feel like it could be helpful in a generalizable way that the magazine that I work for, G's, was founded in Winnipeg and then moved to Detroit like 3 years ago. And we've kept our style guide as Canadian, but we also like in general have a pretty split US and Canadian reader base. And we've worked through tensions of like avoiding US centrism, but also just like, I don't know, just different forms of like North American centrism with our international audience. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that in particular.
About US centrism versus yeah. So in these kinds of cases, it depends in part on who your readership is. So if I'm Vancouver Magazine, it's okay if I'm Vancouver centric. But Cheese is a social justice magazine that comes from a Christian or a faith context, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So if your readership there is progressive Christians who are so then I would say that whoever has been flagging the idea that probably things should be less US centric is probably correct, unless the specific article is about a US story. But if it's about a broader story, I don't know, how Christian folks can show support for another faith group who's undergoing like a political difficulty elsewhere, then I would say avoiding being US centric would be good in that context. It can be tricky though, because I actually didn't realize G's had moved from Canada to the US. But the faith contexts in Canada versus the US are themselves quite different. Canada is a far less Christian, like culturally Christian country in many ways, overtly anyway. It's sort of more subtle. So I can see how that would be really tricky, but it is probably something I think is probably good to try to change. And in terms of how to do that, I think it really comes from reading outside the context that you're comfortable in and getting different perspectives so that you can be aware of those perspectives. It's a rooted thing, right? So it starts at this sort of like writing and assigning stage, and it's something you can flag in copy editing, but then that has to go back to the writer and the editor to reapproach. So I think it's cool you're thinking about it, and it's probably going to be like kind of a slow process of changing, and context dependent. If you're writing about a novel approach to like sharing food in a Michigan community, like outside of the sort of church basement food bank context or something then it's totally fine that it's US centric. But does that answer your, sorry, that's not like I'm not great at definitive answers.
No, it's really helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Nicole made a good point. Disability is an intrinsic part of oneself. A person who uses drugs, it's not a permanent state or something that most people use to identify as themselves as. Yeah, that's a good point. But some of those folks like Dolph and Vandu do include drug users in their names. And Yeah, some folks, the goal isn't actually to stop using drugs at any point. It's just to be able to use them in a safer manner. Yeah, there are a lot of really good resources around this. And I'm not like I can't give a definitive answer on this. The Crackdown podcast, I think that's what it's called, with Garth Mullins. Sorry, I'm just double checking. The Crackdown podcast is a really great thing to listen to. Some of these conversations are less like, what's the right answer and what's the wrong answer, and more kind of like, what can I pay attention to and read from to just sort of keep up with what folks are thinking about. Okay, a really great question. How do I know I'm checking with the right person who knows what language is the most correct / up-to-date term? I mentioned activists and those who have lived experiences. Yeah, this is a really great question. So the answer is, like, you have to pay some attention to each of these areas and have a sense of what's happening on the ground. And that can be tricky, and it can involve a lot of work. So there are a lot of different disability organizations, for example. Some of them are not run by folks with disabilities at all. And so there will be other disability activists who, want to tear their hair out every time they see this organization crop up in a news article. So I think just trying to keep on top of things is the best way to do that. Once you've developed a sort of, you can kind of, oh dear, the way that we talk about this in an editorial context, in terms of freelance writers, for example, the term is always like a stable of freelance writers, which makes writers like horses in a way. Maybe we need a different term. Anyway, but after a certain time, you'll have a group of folks, of experts, that it will be okay to check in with about X, Y, or Z. And on any given issue, like let's say there's a contentious, we have a question about usage or approach for a story that involves a trans person. I might have 2 or 3 people I'll ask the same questions of, and they might not actually even have the same answers. And then we have to weigh those answers and make a decision there. And that's the same in all cases. But yeah, paying attention and then developing some relationships where you can go to folks and ask them questions from time to time. You don't want to like overburden anyone. If it's something that's a regular thing for you, it might be something that your magazine develops like a consulting fee for, so that you're paying people for that work.